let me thank you for what you do every day in informing and educating our community about the issues of the day. I appreciate it a great deal. To Gail Fifth, congratulations on another successful event and for Impacto's effort to bring the community together and instill a continuing effort on economic development, so we appreciate that. And to my dear friend and the United States Treasurer, Rosie Rios, who I was thrilled to be a strong supporter of to the administration in her nomination, and then to see her nomination through the Senate. We're really incredibly fortunate to have a Latina of her intellectual abilities helping the administration think about how in challenging times we create the economic opportunities that can help people realize their hopes and dreams and aspirations. I want to start at a point that Treasurer Rios talked about. She's talked about it lightly, but I think it deserves a little bit more attention. And I say that it's important to focus on this because it gives us a starting point to understand the challenges that we are in the midst of today. If you visited me in Washington and go by the Archives building, on the portal of the Archives building it says, "What is past is prologue." If you understand, in fact, what has happened in the past, you understand, one, how hopefully to learn and avoid it, and secondly, to understand it is a compass point from which we move forward. And in that respect, I want to refer to probably the most incredible meeting I have ever been called to in 38 years of public service, which was in September of 2008, when the chairman of the Federal Reserve, Chairman Bernanke, which is in essence the central bank of the United States, and the Secretary of the Treasury under President Bush, Secretary Paulson, asked members of the Banking Committee, of which I am one and part of the Senate leadership at the time, to come to an emergency meeting in which Chairman Bernanke described a series of financial institutions that were on the verge of collapse. And he said, if they collapse, they will create systemic risk to the entire country's economy, and every American will feel the consequences of that collapse. And the room was pretty hushed. And in the question and answer session, I remember asking Chairman Bernanke, I said, Mr. Chairman, surely you must have enough tools at the Federal Reserve to get us through this period of time. Because what you're asking us to do in the scope, the size, and the immediacy is unprecedented. And he looked at me and he said the most chilling thing I've heard in my entire public service. He looked at me and he said, Senator, with all due respect, if you and your colleagues do not act in the next 2 to 3 weeks, we will have, his words, not mine, we will have a global financial meltdown. And the room was pretty aghast. And I looked at him and I said, Mr. Chairman, that would mean a new depression. And he said, if we allow it to happen, that's exactly what will happen. Markets will pancake across the globe, there'll be a run on the banks, and we will have a depression far beyond what we lived under Roosevelt and that period of history. So we have heard the press and others talk about the Great Recession. What we were on the verge of was the abyss of a new depression. And I think most Americans don't fully appreciate or understand that that's where we were at. Now remember, that is September of 2008, before we even had a presidential election. And in the midst of that was our response, and many of us took very hard votes, to save those financial institutions, not for their own sake, but what would have meant to each and every one of us as Americans in this economy. A wiping out of largely that which we may have worked to be able to position ourselves and our families in life. To save an auto industry in the country that was incredibly important as one of the last manufacturing bases of this country, and an entire supply chain, including many in our region here, that supply parts for that auto industry and for other industries, but without having the auto industry as the foundation of their orders, would not have been able to sustain themselves. Many criticize us for those actions. Today, that auto industry is making profits once again, and we have kept a large manufacturing base and that entire supply chain. So that's where we were in September of 2008. Barack Obama comes to office in late January of 2009, 7.5% unemployment. People forget that we started off at 7.5% unemployment. And before he can take the oath of office at the end of January of 2009, as the treasurer pointed out, nearly 750,000 jobs were lost. But it didn't stop there. In February, while he was putting the cabinet together, another 750,000 jobs were lost. And in March, when he finally got to send a package to the Congress to try to stimulate this economy and moving forward, another 750,000 jobs were lost. In the first quarter of 2009, 2.1 million jobs were lost before this president could act. So I say that so that we understand where we have been coming from, so we understand our challenges today and where we are going tomorrow. Now, recognizing that challenge, the Congress has done a series of things, and I won't repeat all of the initiatives that are already part of law to stimulate particularly the private sector. I want to focus today, in the rest of my remarks, about what we need to continue to do, particularly to grow minority businesses in our country, which in my mind are the backbone of where, in fact, the nation's future progress resides. So when I came to the Senate as a member of the Senate Finance Committee that deals with all tax policy, all trade policy, and anything that needs a revenue source for the federal government comes through the committee, so it has very broad jurisdiction. Or as a member of the Senate Banking Committee that deals with all of our financial institutions broadly defined, and all of the regulators that oversee those financial institutions, my focus has been an access to capital agenda. Now, that has a large spectrum to it. It starts in the very beginning of that spectrum with ending the payday lender and the check cashing place as the portal of entry for our community's entrance into a banking system, where so much of their money is lost as a result of not being banked in any other institution. Because ultimately, consumers of our community who keep more of their money will have more to spend at your businesses and help this economy grow. Secondly, it is about access to capital to small and mid-sized businesses, so that you don't have to pay 3 or 4 points over LIBOR in your firstborn to get access to a loan. And that is incredibly important, which is why my initiative, for example, on CDFIs that was signed into law, $1 billion to leverage consumer development financial institutions in our communities. The initiative that became part of law to create greater tax benefits for those who are willing to invest capital in your businesses and get preferred capital gains benefits from it are some of the initiatives to infuse capital into our communities and our companies. It is about getting the response of what happened in 2008 to that crisis, and that crisis came about by a confluence of issues, 2 wars raging abroad, unpaid for, putting on the next generation of Americans a challenge, tax cuts that are skewed in a way that don't create economic opportunity, and more importantly, are not paid for. I'm for tax cuts that are structured correctly, but you have to pay for them, otherwise you just drive up debt. If you in your businesses, if I deprive you of revenue, you have to offset it in one of 2 ways. You either have to create greater sales, greater revenues, or you have to cut back, right? If I deprive the federal government of revenue, I have to do one of 2 choices. I have to find another revenue source, or I have to cut back. And so we had tax cuts unpaid for that drove debt. We had a new entitlement program passed by a couple of Congresses ago, totally unpaid for. And we had a market that, instead of being a free market, and I'm a big believer in a free market, in which any of you who make an investment, take your money, take the risk, I am rooting for you to do well. But if you fail, I don't want it to become the collective risk of everybody in this room and every American in this country. And that's what happened in 2008, where the decisions of institutions created collective risk for the country, in which all of us ended up paying in some consequence. And so we responded to that. That's commonly known as Dodd-Frank. Now, the problem with that is that in any response, particularly the nature of the emergency we have, the pendulum has swung too far the other way. We need to get it back to the center. And part of my work as a member of the Banking Committee is getting our regulatory agencies to send the right messages to our financial institutions that say we need to get back to responsible lending, not speculative lending, but responsible lending at reasonable terms and conditions. We need to get our housing market, and I chair the housing subcommittee, in a way in which we can invigorate a movement in that market, because we have never ever had a recovery without housing being a critical part of leading us out of that recovery. And so I have a series of initiatives we're working on that. And we need to get access to capital to all of you, because many of you, even in this economy, have businesses that have the wherewithal to grow, but I listen to so many businesses who tell me that I don't have the ability to get the money under reasonable terms to be able to create that growth and meet the contractual opportunities that I have. The other element of my access to capital agenda is how do we get the federal government, and for this we have been working with the Congressional Black Caucus and others, how do we get the federal government to unbundle contracts? Because not everybody's Halliburton at the end of the day. And so many of the businesses that you represent, whether in service or product, have the ability to be incredibly competitive and good services, but you cannot have either the bid bonds or the performance bonds that are necessary to meet these huge contracts that, if unbundled, could probably give the federal government greater benefits in terms of what it would cost, and would allow us to have you all grow. So we continuously work on that. And then my last element of this performance, this access to capital agenda, is at the higher end, so to speak, of the scale. How do we get corporate America to understand that having more members of our diverse communities on corporate boards, senior executive management, and procurement is in the bottom line interest of those companies, not just about doing the right thing, but in their bottom line interest. Because we have seen report after report come out that those companies that are more diverse in their corporate boards and senior executive management produce greater bottom lines. And so last year I started the first ever corporate survey diversity of the Fortune 500 companies as the chair of the Hispanic Task Force of the United States Senate, sent it out under our name in the Senate, and we had a good response rate, probably the largest of any such survey ever done. 75 of the Fortune 100 companies responded, nearly 50% of the Fortune 500 companies responded. And of course, I knew largely what that was going to show, but I needed the science to then drive the public policy. And the science came back with largely that Latinos, women, and African Americans are sorely underrepresented at corporate boards, senior executive management, and certainly in the procurement chain as a percentage of their population of the American society. And as a result of that, we had a series of companies, including CEOs, who called me and said, Senator, I thought we were doing much better, and I just reviewed the report that we're going to submit to you, but I have seen that we're not, which was part of our drive to have an understanding that, in fact, you need to diversify, not for diversity's sake, but because of your bottom line. So this year we have our second annual survey. It is more detailed. Will give us greater access as it relates to the procurement numbers, and we hope that that will help us drive with a whole series of follow-on efforts on best practices that will drive these companies to move in a different direction. And we have major pension funds in the country like CalPERS, and others who are now working with us to drive this agenda, since they are major investors in these companies, to diversify their corporate board, senior executive management, and procurement. What does that mean to all of you? What does that mean to us as a country? It means that if you're a Latino and sitting on a corporate board, you understand this community. You understand how, in fact, to get greater market penetration. You understand where investments can be made. And that will benefit the company, undoubtedly, with a community. Just by one example, this is when we broadened it to African Americans and women in general, and we have a huge part of the American society and the economic marketplace. But we drive an effort in which not only is it good for the companies and their bottom lines, but those investments are made in our communities, in our businesses, access to our entrepreneurs to be part of that supply chain, and that will make decisions that benefit our communities because of those investments, and simultaneously will benefit the companies. And so we are driving that agenda at the other end, including having Wall Street understand that we are not simply looking for their philanthropy, philanthropy, we're looking for their investments. If we take that whole agenda together, we have an opportunity to create prosperity and help people realize their hopes and dreams and aspirations once again. As someone who grew up poor in a tenement, the first in my family to go to college, then go to law school, if you told me that I could rise to be one of 100 United States senators in a country of 308 million people, I would have said that's highly unlikely in my life. But it is the promise of America fulfilled. It is a promise we must keep true for future generations of Americans, and I am convinced that the future is a rising sun, not a setting one. Together we can make that happen. Thank you very much.